At Walter Reed Military Medical Center, they argue that first impressions are often wrong. The Iron Raiders MC were about to discover the hard way that sometimes the most unexpected people can be the most deadly allies. This is the story of Grace Walker, who transformed a group of jaded bikers into friends and allies, and how a single confrontation altered not only the hospital but the entire community. Before we begin, let us share where you're watching from. If this story speaks to you, subscribe now. Tomorrow, we have something even more exciting in store for you. Your bandages need changing, Lieutenant Grace Walker whispered to her gentleman. A feeble smile escaped Lieutenant Rodriguez as he said, "Miss Walker, you're healing better than yesterday. The new medications are helping," he added. "Just a few more weeks and you'll be all set for physical therapy." Grace, with her intense blue eyes fixed on the monitors, checked his vitals. "You know, the guys told me about how you stood up to those bikers yesterday. They said you moved like someone with training," Rodriguez said. Grace's lips curled into a slight smile. "Let's focus on your recovery, Lieutenant." "Come on," she said. "More must be going on with that tale. They said you took down their leader like it was nothing. 3 tours in Afghanistan teach you a few things. Now, take a deep breath for me." Just as Rodriguez was about to press the issue further, Maria Ramirez stormed into the room, Grace's expression changing from gentle nurse to something harder and more focused. Jake tried to speak to them again, but Dr. Harrison told him to tell them to move. "I'll handle this." Grace's voice carried an authority that made Maria pause. "Grace, maybe we should call the police." "Not yet. These men need to learn some respect." "Might as well be today." Grace walked through the hospital corridors, her movements fluid and purposeful. Through the lobby windows she could see Marcus Titan Thompson dismounting his bike surrounded by at least 10 other riders. Their leather cuts gleamed in the morning sun, the Iron Raiders emblem, a stark warning to anyone who dared challenge them. Well, Titan called out as Grace pushed through the doors. "If it isn't the pretty little nurse, brought some friends this time, sweetheart." Still feeling brave, Grace's voice carried across the parking lot, clear and unwavering. "Those spots are for our wounded veterans. Move the bikes now." Titan laughed, the sound echoing off the hospital walls. "Or what you'll call the cops." "No," Grace said, moving closer. "First I'll give you a chance to do the right thing, then I'll make you big." Nathan Davidson, Titan, second in command, stepped forward. "Listen, lady, you don't want to start something you can't finish." Grace's eyes locked on to his 3 tours as a combat nurse in Afghanistan, Silver Star recipient. "Trust me." The altercation was being watched by a crowd, which included hospital personnel, patients, visitors, and Frank Peterson, a Vietnam veteran who volunteered at the hospital. Peterson noticed something about Grace's posture and how she positioned herself. "This wasn't your average nurse. You may have heard the stories about the warrior yesterday, but today it was me being gentle." As Grace continued to address the bikers. "Well, that depends on you." Titan moved toward her, making her look small in comparison, but Grace didn't back down. If anything, her presence seemed to grow. "You think you can take on all of us because you played nurse in the sandbox," but Grace's smile was cold. "No, I think I can handle a few bullies who think leather cuts make them tough." The tension in the air was electric, but hospital security stayed back after Grace's last chance. Grace said, "Move the bikes, apologize to our veteran." It had been the final error. He'd make that day. Grace moved with the fluid grace of someone who trained for precisely this moment. Her hand caught his wrist, her body pivoted, and suddenly the massive biker was airborne. He crashed to the pavement with a thud that made everyone wince before the other bikers could react. Grace had Titan in a joint lock, her knee precisely positioned to cause maximum discomfort with minimal damage. It was the kind of hold taught to combat medics, designed to subdue without seriously injuring first. "Lesson," she said, her voice carrying to the stunned crowd, "is that appearances can be deceiving. Second lesson is about respect. These spots there for men and women who gave pieces of themselves for this country. Every time you take these spaces you dishonor their sacrifice." "Get off me," Titan growled, but Grace only applied slightly more pressure. "No. You're going to listen, because after this we're either going to have a serious problem or you're going to understand exactly what this place means, and Why you'll never disrespect it again. The other bikers stood frozen, uncertain how to handle this situation. Their leader was pinned by a nurse half his size, and something in her voice and her precision told them this was no lucky move. I've treated men with more courage in their little finger than you've shown in your entire life, Grace continued. I've held their hands as they died, promised to deliver messages to their families and watch them fight through pain. Lieutenant Rodriguez's words echoed over the throng, reminding everyone that by parking in their spots and bringing your intimidation games to their hospital, you are not only disrespecting them, but also every sacrifice that has been made for the liberties you enjoy. That is the steel. No, Lieutenant, they don't teach it in nursing school, ma'am. Grace let herself a tiny smile. Forged in the fires of battle, that is the steel. Grace lifted her gaze from Titan, poised to have a respectful conversation about how we treat each other. The outcome of the day depended on the bikers' reaction, but one thing was clear: the Iron Raiders MC had just learned a valuable lesson about judging people by their looks. Grace had started to demonstrate true strength to them. Suddenly, Big Nathan called out, his voice cutting through the tension. Grace let go of Titan, stepping back smoothly while maintaining her ready stance. Titan slowly stood up, rubbing his shoulder with a mix of anger and something else, and he asked, "How did you learn to move like that?" Dr. James Harrison, his white coat immaculate and his expression concerned, stepped out of the hospital, spoke to Grace, and demanded, "When you're a combat nurse, you learn fast that treating the wounded is meaningless if you can't protect them." Grace's voice remained steady throughout. Dr. Harrison. Grace responded, her gaze fixed on the motorcyclists. Big Nathan advanced, his towering stature obstructing the sun. "You mentioned being in Afghanistan, where exactly?" "The Helmand province of Kandahar is pretty much everywhere." Combat nurses were necessary. Grace looked into Big Nathan's eyes as he served 2 tours with the Marines. Big Nathan's voice had become less hostile, but he had never encountered a nurse who could fight. He had to learn to protect medical units from insurgent attacks, which resulted in the loss of too many patients. Titan had been silently observing the exchange. Now he spoke with a less forceful tone. Grace pointed to the handicapped spots, and that is why these spaces are important. Some of the attackers injured the men and women who rely on them for medical supplies and civilian areas. You mentioned a Taliban ambush, and our convoy was ambushed as well. 15 people were wounded, and there was no way to evacuate them. We spent 6 hours treating wounds and warding off attacks. Grace spoke in a matter-of-fact manner, but her eyes seemed distant. The other patients had gathered around Lieutenant Rodriguez as he wheeled himself to the entrance. She was being humble. He yelled out, "My buddy was in that convoy and she took out 3 insurgents while doing triage." You're dubbing her the Angel of Kandahar, which made Grace feel uneasy. "We all did what we had to do that day," Grace replied, her lip curled into a small smile. Ray Doc Martinez, one of the Iron Raiders, who had been standing back, suddenly rushed forward. "You were a combat medic there, helping to treat some of your wounded following an evacuation." Doc examined the shackles, "And boss, I remember hearing about that ambush." Grace, the nurse who helped bring your troops in, nodded. "This woman is the genuine deal, what she did that day." Titan glanced at his motorcycles before turning back to Grace, who he had just spoken to, and said, "All right." The mood had changed, and the hostility had faded, replaced by something more nuanced. Grace noticed that her posture was relaxing a bit, but her eyes remained vigilant. "You know, Big Nathan," he said, coming over to stand by her. "Finally, boys, move the bikes to their regular spots." The ironous sound of the Iron Raiders' machines filled the air. They only perceive danger, but the majority perceive a beautiful nurse and assume she poses no threat, Grace retorted. Dr. Harrison contacted Claire Thompson, Grace's social worker at the hospital, and advised that we all take a closer look. "We've been trying to find ways to engage with the veteran community, so what do you think?" Grace inquired, but it seemed like she recognized many of our patients from her face. "You mentioned that this is prime terrain, but not for trouble. How about for something that matters?" Claire gave the motorcyclists a serious look, and Grace turned to face Titan, who was returning from parking his bike. "What are you suggesting?" he asked with a cautious yet interested tone. "We have veterans who need rides to appointments and others who just need someone to talk to who understands. It seems like a lot of you have military experience," and Big Nathan nodded slowly. "After returning from serving, many of us lost that sense of brotherhood. Instead of taking space from wounded veterans, use it," Grace pressed. "May I offer my assistance to them? Let that brotherhood provide them with rides." Doc came forward. "Boss, and she has a valid point, they are missing. Once you return, keep in mind the reason we began collaborating on writing." After a prolonged period of silence during which he studied his crew and the hospital, Titan looked over to Grace and said, "You always turn enemies into allies this way. Only the ones worth turning are worth keeping." Grace then asked, "So, what are you saying? Are you looking for an opportunity to make a difference?" The answer would have far-reaching consequences, impacting not only the Iron Raiders but also Walter Reed and its patients. As Titan contemplated his response, Grace recognized a look in his eyes that she knew from her time in combat. It was the expression of someone who had discovered a new mission. The assembled crowd, consisting of hospital staff, patients, and bikers, eagerly anticipated the outcome of this confrontation, whether it would be characterized by continued hostility or something more positive. Titan extended his hand to Grace, a gesture that surprised even his own crew. "All right, Angel, let's hear what you have to say," Grace said, firmly taking his hand. "My name is Grace Walker. Save Angel for when you've earned the right to use it." A low laugh echoed through the gathered bikers, and Big Nathan grinned. As they made their way to the hospital entrance, he motioned for the social worker to follow. Lieutenant Rodriguez wheeled himself alongside Grace. "I remember thinking this place was just another hospital when I first arrived. Now I'm witnessing combat nurses neutralize bikers and transform them into allies. It's never boring, is it?" "Pay attention to your recuperation, Lieutenant," Grace said as she patted his shoulder and smiled. In Dr. Harrison's office, there was a clear contrast between the clean furniture and medical certificates. Grace noticed that Big Nathan and Titan sat back straight and respectfully, as if their old military habits were showing. Claire started by opening a folder and asked, "We have over 200 veterans who regularly need transportation to appointments. Many of them don't have family nearby and standard medical transport isn't always reliable. How many bikes do you have on crew?" Grace answered with 20 regular riders, but they could call in more if needed. Additionally, she asked if any of the veterans had regular day shift jobs. Doc had mentioned that half of the crew works nights or odd hours. They include former service members. Grace nodded, acknowledging that it's not all about rides. Sometimes, these men and women simply need someone who knows what they're going through, Big Nathan would ask softly from time to time, but he couldn't be everywhere. Grace paused, carefully selecting her words. Some of these people relate better to other combat veterans, to others who have seen what they have. Titan leaned forward, asking, "What are you asking us to do exactly?" Claire proposed that we arrange rides so that veterans can be paired with others who served in the same area or branch. Grace suggested that some of you could use the recreation room to play cards, share stories, and reassure the veterans that they are not alone. Dr. Harrison, who had been silently watching, finally spoke up. Of course, this would necessitate training, background checks, and patient confidentiality. The room went silent as Titan assured Grace, "My men will comply with the protocols." Grace observed him intently, and he surprised everyone with his swift agreement. "We may look rough, Doc, but we understand about protocols." This wasn't a small commitment, and the veterans would rely on him and trust him. "This is what we've been lacking, boss. When we started the MC, it was supposed to be about brotherhood and having each other's backs. Instead of making trouble in hospital parking lots," Doc nodded in agreement. The question carried a heavy burden of shared understanding about duty, trust, and responsibility. Grace softly replied. Big Nathan stood up, his massive frame making the office feel smaller. Titan glanced at his guys one by one before turning to Grace. "What about the other medical professionals? We might be having a significant impact." Grace assured me that they trust my judgment, and if they don't, she said with a little smile, "They just saw me effortlessly defeat your entire crew. So, they might not be so welcome. I believe they will pay attention." Claire has begun to make notes. "We may begin with a trial run, helping out only 5 or 6 veterans who have asked for transportation. This has nothing to do with authority or jurisdiction, as Grace included as a condition." All eyes were on her as she spoke. "I will not tolerate a return to my previous ways of thinking under any circumstances." By the time they left the office, Grace could hear the whispers and curious glances from the hospital staff. Word had spread quickly about what happened in the parking lot, but now that she saw the bikers walking respectfully through the halls, something was changing. Titan stood extending his hand again, saying, "You have my word." In our world, that means something. In any world worth being a part of, it should. Grace responded by shaking his hand. Dr. Emily Brooks, who had just finished her emergency department shift, grabbed Grace's arm. "Could it be? Can we trust that they will actually assist in transporting veterans?" As the motorcyclists made their way out of the parking lot, Grace remarked, "People just need a chance to remember who they really are." Emily shook her head in disbelief, but Grace reminded her that only someone who has seen combat from both sides can understand how an adversary can become an ally in the blink of an eye. As the Iron Raiders got on their bikes, Grace could hear a shift, less aggression, more purpose, as they rode away from the hospital. She waited anxiously outside the entrance, knowing that the following day would bring new opportunities, challenges, and maybe even a new chapter in Walter Reed Military Medical Center's history. James, as the sun rose, her eyes instinctively searched for the Iron Raiders, but she instead spotted Dr. Harrison waiting at the entryway. As she retrieved her bag from the car, she asked, "I wanted to catch you before the rumors started spreading about yesterday's hospital board meeting." Grace was having second thoughts about the program, but actually, they're intrigued by your unique approach to conflict resolution. "So, what you're saying is that she wants to catch you before the rumors spread?" "That is the section." A little smile appeared on Dr. Harrison's face, "But what really piques my attention is what followed. How had you anticipated their reaction to that strategy?" Grace took a moment to gather her thoughts before responding. "In Afghanistan, I learned something important. The toughest fighters often have the strongest sense of honor. They just need reminding of it every now and then." Just as Dr. Harrison was about to respond, the sound of motorcycles rumbled through the air, but this time they were different. 3 bikes, with Titan and Docs, were parked in regular spaces. Grace, who was checking her watch, claimed that they were promptly on time. "Starting with Captain Foster today, we have Captain David Foster, a young Army Ranger paralyzed from the waist down after a mission in Syria. He has been facing transportation issues and has been struggling with his physical therapy appointments, often missing them." As the morning light revealed the bikers, who appeared almost uncomfortable, Doc carried a small notebook. "Last night, he made some calls and, as a greeting, got 10 more riders willing to volunteer. All of the riders are vets with clean records." Grace nodded in agreement. "Captain Foster is required to report to PT by 8 in the morning. I have faith in your abilities, so we're here early. Big Nathan wanted to double-check the setup, so that's why." Dr. Harrison's interest in the exchange grew as he emphasized the need to properly fasten his wheelchair. Captain Foster was already dressed and waiting inside, his eyes startled at the sight of the motorcycles, then narrowed when he recognized their patches. "It's okay." These were not the same individuals that had caused turmoil in his parking lot yesterday. Grace David reassured him. Doc, who served as a combat medic for 3 tours similar to yours, responded to Foster's question, "Which unit? 3rd Battalion 2nd Marines?" Foster's expression softened slightly, and he smiled. The tension in the room subsided as Foster uttered the words, "You Rangers have saved our asses more than once." The captain, Chain, took a step forward, and the rest of us are here to serve, if you'll allow us." Grace watched as the bikers assisted Foster, their movements deliberate and respectful, as they transferred him from his hospital wheelchair to their modified bike setup. Doc's medical training shone through as they ensured Foster's comfort and dignity during the transfer. "This is actually happening. Did you have any doubts about it?" Dr. Harrison whispered next to her. His finger swept across the landscape before them, and I was taken aback by what I saw. While Grace attended to her usual responsibilities, she kept a close eye on the program. As the bikers returned with Foster, she witnessed his beaming excitement. "Best ride of my life," he exclaimed as they helped him back into his chair. "Doc here knows all the smooth roads. Man, that breeze felt like flying again." By lunchtime, word had spread quickly throughout the hospital, and Claire Thompson was overwhelmed with inquiries about the transportation program. "We need a proper system," she thought. Over coffee, she informed Grace about forms, schedules, and the possibility of a dedicated coordinator. Grace nodded in agreement as she watched Big Nathan assist an elderly Vietnam veteran to his bike. Their natural abilities were evident in their collaborative nature. Claire noticed more than that. Again, they're discovering their purpose. Steve Hammer Jackson, the Iron Raiders road captain, was surprised to see 5 more riders and a gift of custom motorcycle helmets painted in military branch colors. "Thought our passengers might appreciate riding in style," he explained, explaining how each helmet had been modified to be easily put on and removed, even for those with limited mobility. Grace looked at the helmets, taking note of their high quality and meticulous attention to detail. The club had started a collection chain, and everyone had contributed, even those who weren't riding. "Why did you do that?" Grace turned to face him, asking, "Why did you do that? You didn't just beat me down, you woke us up. Reminded us what it means to serve something bigger than ourselves." Ja cut into their moment. "They're hassling one of our patients." Grace's expression hardened. "Show me," but before she could move, Titan put a hand on her shoulder. "Let us handle this one time to show you what the Iron Raiders can really do when we're on the right side." Grace hesitated, then nodded. "All right, show me." As they headed toward the east lot, Grace realized that yesterday's confrontation hadn't just changed the Iron Raiders, it had started something much bigger, a transformation that would affect everyone at Walter Reed, and perhaps reach far beyond its walls. The scene in the east parking lot was tense. 3 unknown bikers were surrounding an elderly veteran in a wheelchair, their aggressive postures making their intentions clear. The veteran, whom Grace recognized as Master Sergeant Williams, sat straight back, refusing to show fear. Titan assessed the situation with a single glance. "Death Reapers MC," he muttered. "Small-time thugs trying to make a name for themselves." The Iron Raiders moved with practiced precision, spreading out to flank the troublemakers. Grace noticed how they positioned themselves, military formation, creating a protective barrier around Williams. "Gentleman," Titan called out, his voice carrying authority, "you're on the wrong turf." The leader of the Death Reapers turned, his sneer faltering slightly at the sight of the Iron Raiders' patches. "Since when do the Raiders care about some hospital?" "Master Sergeant, are you okay?" Big Nathan has advanced, his enormous form throwing a shadow, and the man you're harassing is now under our protection. Grace has gone to Williams's side, and she's assessing him for symptoms of distress. "Okay, no problem." In a composed response, Ms. Walker Williams said, "These boys were just leaving, weren't they?" The leader of the Death Reapers had chuckled, but there was still an air of mystery. "With a step closer," no, Titan responded. The Death Reapers, realizing they were outnumbered, looked around. Their leader attempted to save face, but we shouldn't have wasted our time there. Doc and Hammer had flawlessly coordinated their position behind the Death Reapers, cutting off their retreat. "Last chance," Titan continued. "Now, let's forget about this and spread the word that Walter Reed is under Iron Raider protection." As they sped off on their motorcycles, Grace couldn't help but notice something remarkable. The Iron Raiders had handled the situation with complete tact and strategy, without resorting to physical force. "Impressive," she thought to herself. Titan shrugged, as if to say, "Sometimes the best fights are the ones you prevent." Williams chuckled, recalling a time when their old unit had triumphed in close quarters without losing a single member. News of the incident spread like wildfire, but instead of sowing panic, it appeared to have strengthened the trust between the hospital and the Iron Raiders. Jake had asked Grace, "Did you see how they moved? Like a well-oiled machine?" Grace had replied, "No, and neither does the instinct to protect." Claire had arranged an unscheduled meeting in the recreation center later that afternoon. Grace stood by the doorway as the barriers crumbled, and the leather cuts blended in with the other patients' gowns and uniforms. "My dad had been there, and he said it was awful." Doc spoke back, "But we were there for each other." Dr. Emily Brooks accompanied her as she observed the incident. "You remember when I first heard about your confrontation in the parking lot? It was like another kind of brotherhood. Just when I thought you couldn't be much crazier," she pointed to the room. Another change that occurred during the day was that healing can take on unexpected forms. For example, Grace responded, "Sometimes it wears leather and rides a Harley." The Iron Raiders instituted a rotation schedule to guarantee that someone was available for security or transportation at all times, and they began to wear patches that identified them as volunteers from Walter Reed. As Grace was wrapping up her shift, Titan approached her and came up with a proposition. "I'm paying attention. We're considering establishing a comprehensive program to serve veterans, not limited to transportation and security." Grace, from the Iron Raiders Veterans Alliance, raised an eyebrow. In response to yesterday's comment about delving deeper, Grace realized that we'd been focusing on the wrong things. She didn't hesitate to dash toward the emergency room, but she couldn't help but overhear Titan ordering his men to clear the corridors so medical staff could enter. As she ran, Grace couldn't help but think about how much had changed in just 2 days. The Iron Raiders were no longer merely offering rides. When she arrived at the intensive care unit, she discovered Doc waiting for her. He had heard the code and was ready to help the staff, demonstrating that these men were more than what they seemed. The situation was resolved swiftly, but it had taught everyone a valuable lesson. The Iron Raiders were no longer mere visitors. They were a unit, and at Walter Reed, that meant being prepared for everything. The following day, Grace showed there to locate Titan, and Big Nathan was engrossed in a heated debate with Dr. Harrison about what was happening. She inquired, observing their grave faces, and was told by our sources that the Titan of Death were plotting something. They refused to let yesterday's shame go. Dr. Harrison was worried, "Should we beef up security? Big Nathan has already taken care of getting motorcyclists stationed at each entrance, but that isn't the thing that concerns me." Grace crossed her arms. "Does it annoy you that they're trying to turn other MCs against us by spreading tales about how we've gotten too mellow and have become nothing more than hospital lapdogs?" Grace asked directly, and Titan met her gaze. "No, what worries me is that they might try to prove a point by making this place an example," she said. At that moment, Lieutenant Rodriguez rolled over to Grace and said, "Sorry to interrupt, but you need to hear this." He then looked at Grace and said, "Some of my buddies in rehab are saying that their families are getting harassed when they return home from visits." Grace's expression hardened, and she growled, but effectively, that they are targeting families. "We can't let patients' loved ones be scared to see them." Dr. Harrison shook his head. After Grace studied him, the Iron Raiders announced that they will begin providing escorts to any member of the family who requests one. "We have a situation with Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman who visits her son in the burn unit. Last night, I made some calls. Remember those 10 veterans? They're bringing friends and whole chapters are reaching out to help." Claire Thompson rushed up to Grace to tell her about it. Grace wasted no time getting going, but the Titan snatched her arm again, and this time she nodded in unison. When they finally arrived at the parking lot, they discovered 3 Death Reapers circling Mrs. Chen's car, their engines revving menacingly. The old woman sat motionless behind the wheel, and the Iron Raiders spread out smoothly under the quiet command of Formation Delta Titan. Grace approached the car head-on, with the bikers flanking her, and her voice cutting through the din of the engines. Grace yelled at them to step away, and the leader, who was noticeably different from yesterday, chuckled. "What was the nurse going to do to get us out of here?" But she calmly responded, "First, I'll give you the opportunity to leave, and then my friends here will demonstrate to you why the Iron Raiders earned their reputation." Big Nathan's voice rumbled from behind them, and she urged him to trust her. Grace recognized a few of the veterans among the additional Iron Raiders who had arrived secretly and encircled the Death Reapers. Wearing Iron Raider support patches, these former military members have been helping out recently. When the leader of the Death Reapers realized the gravity of the situation, he looked around. Grace announced that Walter Reed and its patients and their families were under the protection of the Iron Raiders, and the Death Reapers retreated, their departure being much less dramatic than their arrival. Grace helped an elderly woman from her car, and she noticed that her hands were shaking. "Thank you," whispered Mrs. Chen. "No longer was I frightened." Grace reassured her that going forward, relatives will always be accompanied by an escort when they visit. A staff meeting was called to order by Dr. Harrison. "The Iron Raiders are now essentially our security partners. The situation has gone beyond simply giving veterans transportation. We must properly handle this," he said. Grace observed Titan carefully as they took notes. The change from enemy to ally was astounding, and processes were already in place. Doc stepped forward and spread out a detailed organizational chart based on combat convoy procedures. He offered escort rotations communication protocols in the style of the military. Each family gets 2 riders, and there is minimum radio contact throughout designated safe routes. The hospital staff stared at the professional presentation. Looking over the plans, Grace commented, "I've seen military units with less organization." Big Nathan proudly said, "Once a soldier, always a soldier, we just traded our uniforms for leather." The meeting went on, but Grace's thoughts were already racing. The Iron Raiders weren't just providing a service anymore. That night, when Grace was wrapping up her rounds, it felt just natural that they were becoming indispensable to the hospital's operation. She found Lieutenant Rodriguez in the recreation room deep in conversation with several Iron Raiders. They were gathered around a map of the city marking routes and checkpoints planning something she asked approaching the group. Big Nathan's idea. Rodriguez replied, "We're creating safe corridors routes families can take to and from the hospital where Raiders will always be present like supply lines in combat zones." Grace observed exactly. Big Nathan nodded. "Predictable routes are easier to protect plus it lets us use our resources efficiently." Suddenly Jake burst into the room. "Grace, Dr. Harrison needs you." There's a situation at admin. When Grace arrived at the administrative offices, she found Dr. Harrison facing down 3 men in expensive suits. Hospital board members. Miss Walker, one of them said, "Perhaps you can explain why our hospital has become a biker headquarters." Before Grace could respond, Titan walked in followed by Doc. The contrast between their leather cuts and the board members' suits was stark. "Perfect timing," Chain said, pulling out a folder. "Brought the proposal you asked for, Dr. Harrison." The board members looked confused as Titan laid out professional-looking documents. Grace caught glimpses of chart schedules and detailed security protocols. "What's this?" one board member asked. "It turns out that many of our members have administrative experience in the military," and Grace was impressed by the comprehensiveness of the paperwork she picked up from the Iron Raiders Veterans Alliance's official proposal. Titan, which included liability insurance, background checks, and operational procedures. Who would have thought? After the Iron Raiders began providing escorts, Veteran Support Services saw a 40% increase in family visitation, a 50% decrease in missed appointments, and a 60% decrease in security problems, as reported by Jake from the doorway. Dr. Harrison cleared his throat and addressed the audience. As a result of the Iron Raiders' proximity, the board members drew in close, muttering between themselves. At last, their spokesperson turned around and went back. Grace observed as the board members' expressions changed from skepticism to interest, indicating that the Iron Raiders had done their research. Doc interrupted by retrieving additional paperwork. "We have formed a legitimate non-profit with full insurance coverage and have even attracted the interest of some corporate sponsors." A board member asked incredulously about the use of motorcycles in the program, and Grace used Brotherhood to correct him, saying that the bikes are just tools and that the real healing comes from having someone who understands. Lieutenant Rodriguez and several other patients rolled in, and I was told that the Raiders saved my life. The board members observed the assembled throng of nurses, motorcyclists, patients, and spokesman Dr. Harrison, asking, "Miss Walker, could you stay the rest?" They offered me more than just transportation to physical therapy, they gave me hope for a speedier recovery. As everyone else left, Grace locked eyes with Titan, and he nodded slightly. They both knew this was it, the moment of truth. Miss Walker, a board member, started by saying, "Your innovative approach to hospital security has certainly produced unexpected results. Sometimes the best solutions aren't the obvious ones." In response, Grace straightened her back in combat, where she learned to recognize potential allies even in unlikely places. The Iron Raiders needed purpose, our veterans needed support. After some back and forth, the board members nodded and said, "Very well, Dr. Harrison, you have our approval to formalize the arrangement. However, we want regular reports and Miss Walker. Yes, the board would like you to serve as official liaison between the hospital and the Iron Raiders Veterans Alliance with appropriate compensation." Grace subsequently left the office, but the arrangement had already been formalized. After finding the Titan, Grace grinned and said, "We're official, the Iron Raiders Veterans Alliance is now part of Walter Reed." His demeanor remained serious, but he said, "Good, because we're going to need that official backing." Grace's smile faded as she said, "How big?" Grace wants to know if we are prepared for the impending storms, which are large enough to warrant a call in every chapter across 3 states. Grace arrived at the hospital the following day to find the parking lot crowded with bikes. It wasn't only the Iron Raiders, but also veterans from other chapters and clubs who had responded to the need for help. When she asked Big Nathan, who was in charge of parking, how many there were, he couldn't tell. Doc had set up a command center in an unused conference room. The room was buzzing with activity, with maps covering the walls and radios crackling with updates from riders patrolling the area. As Grace entered, she tried to pull in other outlaw clubs, making this about territory and respect. "Word got out about what we're doing here and what happened with you and Titan. We're calling it the Walter Reed Alliance. Territory is not the issue here." Grace's jaw clenched as she begged for the arrival of Lieutenant Rodriguez, explaining her concerns. "We need to show them what we're really about, not just the Raiders, but everyone here," Grace said, her voice tinged with worry. Dr. Emily Brooks hurried in, her worried expression betraying Grace's demands. "Patients are requesting transfers, and their families are terrified of the rumors." At first, Big Nathan was hesitant to let the Iron Raiders Veterans Alliance see the true nature of their threat, a threat to not only the hospital but the entire community. However, after Grace insisted that they see the threat for what it really is, a threat to Death Reapers, the plan swiftly took shape. The Iron Raiders reached out to local news outlets, and by noon, the hospital grounds had transformed. Writers from various chapters had set up displays showcasing their veteran support program, and former combat medics had organized a medical station where they offered basic health screenings. Lieutenant Rodriguez guided a group of patients in sharing their stories, and before the Raiders arrived, he addressed the growing crowd. "I haven't skipped a physical therapy session in weeks, since I was absent for half of them. These guys aren't merely rideshares." In a heartwarming turn of events, Grace witnessed families who had been filled with fear mingling with bikers. Children sat on parked motorcycles, listening to the Raiders' safety talks. A local reporter approached Grace and asked, "Miss Walker, is it true? You brought this whole thing to a halt by eliminating the head of a motorcycle gang?" "No," she corrected. Claire Thompson had set up a registration booth for families in need of escorts. The queue stretched across the parking lot. "This is just incredible. I began by demonstrating to a group of veterans how to return to their traditional role as protectors, brothers in arms." She assured Grace that all enrolled riders had prior military service. Not only do they provide protection, but they also offer understanding. All of a sudden, Grace heard a crackling noise on the radio at Dock Station, and she realized that the Death Reapers had spotted multiple groups heading in this direction. Despite the tension in the air, the families and veterans remained put, standing closer together with their newfound protectors. As Titan drew near, Grace received a call to evacuate. "No," she interrupted him. "We will stay our ground and show them the truth." The sound of approaching motorcycles became louder, but when the Death Reapers arrived at the hospital entrance, they were met with an unexpected sight. Lined up along the driveways were hundreds of bikes, and veterans and leather cutters stood shoulder to shoulder with wheelchair-bound patients. Families gathered behind them, and news cameras rolled. Grace advanced, her voice echoing through the suddenly silent room. "You wanted this to be about territory? Take a look around." The leader of the Death Reapers looked around, his attitude changing from one of hostility to one of confusion. This wasn't the kind of confrontation he had anticipated. The situation had escalated beyond mere gang rivalry when a small girl darted out of the crowd and rushed up to an Iron Raider who had been assisting her father. She fiercely hugged his leg and stared defiantly at the Death Reapers, proclaiming, "My daddy's safe because of them." The air was thick with cameras capturing every moment, and the leader of the Death Reapers glanced at his men before returning his gaze to the scene before him. They arrived expecting conflict, but instead discovered a community. The leader of the Death Reapers got off his bike and took off his helmet, his voice clearly saying, "This isn't what we heard." Grace tried to intervene, but Titan raised a hand and said, "No, let me handle this." Rick Titan approached the leader, his posture relaxed but purposeful. He called out the leader's name, and 300 riders, all veterans who remember what it means to serve something bigger than themselves, gathered around. Big Nathan positioned himself to flank Titan, and you could see the men and women in wheelchairs. The families who support our veterans are the ones who keep them connected when the nightmares hit. Rick looked uneasy as Grace noticed some of his riders looking around, their expressions changing as they took everything in. A lot of them were younger, probably recruited more for their fighting spirit than their knowledge of biker culture. "You're making us seem weak, Rick." No doctor stepped forward, "but we're remembering our identity." "How many of your guys are veterans, Rick? How many of them returned home feeling lost? In search of the camaraderie they enjoyed while serving?" A rumble resounded among the Death Reapers. A number of riders doffed their helmets, their expressions betraying the animosity they had been experiencing. Lieutenant Rodriguez advanced, and the Iron Raiders came to our aid. "I was considering quitting physical therapy because it was so difficult and getting to appointments was a living nightmare. Now I have an army fighting for me," he said, gesturing to the assembled audience. One of the Death Reapers even broke ranks and rode forward on his bike. He was in his early to mid-20s. "I left the 3rd Infantry last year." He glanced at Rick and thought, "This isn't what I signed up for." As the situation escalated, more Death Reapers took off their helmets, some bearing faces that were too young to have the animosity they were harboring. Grace observed Titan's unexpected diplomacy in handling the situation. The Veterans Alliance could use more riders. Rick glanced at his disintegrating crew before turning back to the united front in front of him. The news cameras caught every moment as he cautiously approached the Titan. "This changes everything," he whispered. "It already has, Titan," the questioner replied. "Are you going to be a part of the change or stand against it?" Dr. Harrison showed up next to Grace. "You anticipated this outcome, didn't you, when you proposed the open house?" The tension subsided as Rick extended his hand, suggesting, "Maybe we should talk." What transpired next was extraordinary, as onlookers witnessed exes reuniting and exchanging anecdotes. Grace verbalized her disapproval. "This has nothing to do with bikes or territory, but I was hoping you picked up on the fact that changing the battlefield before a conflict ever starts is the best way to win them. Several ex-Death Reapers have shown interest in the escort program, so Claire was busy coordinating additional sign-ups. We'll have to increase the size of the training program." The story was changing from one of possible violence to one of redemption and community, as reported by Miss Walker, a reporter, and Grace was informed enthusiastically that local news teams were conducting field interviews with soldiers, riders, and their families. "What does it feel like to be the one to initiate this?" Grace pointed out that I hadn't started it. Sometimes the most powerful tool isn't a pistol or a fist, I was only restating what everyone already understood. At times. This is bigger than Walter Reed. Now other hospitals are going to want what we've built here, Big Nathan asked Grace. Grace watched as former Death Reapers sat with Iron Raiders planning escort routes and security protocols. Then we'll help them build it. As the afternoon progressed, the atmosphere transformed into something like a celebration. Food trucks arrived, drawn by the crowd. Children played between parked motorcycles while their parents shared stories. Isn't that the essence of service? What started as a parking dispute turned into a model of efficiency as riders from multiple clubs, including reformed Death Reapers, worked together to escort veterans and their families. Grace knew this was just the beginning of the transformation that had taken place that day. The Walter Reed Alliance had shown that allies can be enemies turned into allies. A month later, Grace stood in the hospital parking lot and watched a remarkable scene unfold. After hearing Dr. Harrison's words, Grace responded by observing Rick, a former leader of the Death Reapers, assist a veteran in making the transition from a wheelchair to a specially modified bike. The Iron Raiders Veterans Alliance had outgrown everyone's expectations. It had begun at Walter Reed and had since expanded to 5 other regional hospitals. The model had been so successful that military medical centers nationwide were contacting Grace Clare, who had hurried over with a tablet, for advice. The Veterans Affairs Office recently published a report on our program, and the results were astounding. For example, there was an 80% increase in veteran attendance at medical appointments, a doubling of family visits, and a significant decrease in patient reports of depression and isolation. These improvements were not limited to the rides, though. Lieutenant Rodriguez, who was preparing for discharge after completing his rehabilitation ahead of schedule, also mentioned them. At that moment, a group of motorcyclists swung into the parking lot. The leaders had just returned from a meeting of MC leaders from various states who were interested in starting similar programs. "You won't believe this," he said as he dismounted. "We have 23 clubs ready to start their own Veterans Alliance chapters. Even the old-school outlaw clubs are coming around." Grace noticed something new on him, a patch that read, "Veterans First." Other riders from different clubs were also sporting similar patches, symbolizing their shared mission. "And I have something else to show you," Big Nathan exclaimed. He escorted them to a recently arrived truck, which contained boxes of medical supplies donated by corporations who had heard about their program. "This is just the beginning," the doctor explained, adding, "Companies want to support what we're doing. We've got offers for everything from medical equipment to custom bikes for disabled vets." It's not just the resources that have evolved. Grace had witnessed the riders' transformation as well. Once rivals, they now work together, putting their feuds in the past. "Remember that first day?" Titan asked, standing beside me, "when you took me down in front of everyone?" Grace smiled. Now it felt like an eternity, but it was more than just a biker. Assembled walls fell. It was at this point that a news crew arrived and interrupted their conversation, asking, "Miss Walker, did you ever imagine your confrontation with the Iron Raiders would lead to this?" The story of the Veterans Alliance had gone national, inspiring similar movements across the country. The cameras swept across the parking lot, capturing the new reality at Walter Reed. Veterans receiving treatment, families arriving without fear, riders from different clubs working together seamlessly. "We're now receiving calls from police departments." Grace corrected the focus. "This is about what happens when people remember their true strength isn't in creating fear, but in helping others." Grace just explained that we offered them a purpose worth serving, and that's how we turned competitor clubs into community partners. After that, everything else fell into place. Dr. Emily Brooks hurried out of the emergency room, and Grace got a case involving a multi-car pileup on the highway. "What makes this work," Grace informed the television crew, "is that we have family attempting to get patients, but traffic is jammed." Titan was on his radio before Grace could react, and within minutes, riders from 3 separate clubs were organizing, providing escort routes around the pandemonium. These days, it's not about who has the most territory or who can be the most intimidating. The reporter seemed impressed, and Grace couldn't help but laugh, because it all began because they messed with the wrong nurse. It's about service, about being there when people need you the most. Grace found herself addressing a packed auditorium at Walter Reed Military Medical Center 6 weeks after the transformation began. The audience consisted of military officials, hospital administrators from across the nation, and representatives from numerous motorcycle clubs. They were all there to learn about the Veterans Alliance program. Grace started when I confronted the Iron Raiders in our parking lot. Titan, his leather cut now displaying many service patches, and I thought we were tough. We weren't planning to create a revolution, we were just trying to defend my patients. However, sometimes the greatest way to protect people is to teach others to become protectors themselves. The presentation featured video testimonials from veterans and their families. Lieutenant Rodriguez, who is now walking with crutches, shared how the program had transformed his recovery. These men did more than just give me rides, they demonstrated true toughness by lifting others up instead of pushing them down. He spoke about how they restored his sense of purpose and how he is preparing to write to help others in the same way that they helped him. Rick, the former head of the Death Reapers, spoke up to offer his perspective. We came here expecting a fight, but we ended up having a meaningful conversation. During the break, Grace overheard comments that demonstrated the progress made. One administrator told Titan, "Our hospital in Denver needs this program. The furious veterans are now teaching younger vets and utilizing their strength to serve instead of intimidating. How would one go about starting it?" While demonstrating their new monitoring system to a group of VA officials, Doc made sure to record every escort and ride. The Veterans Alliance is quickly becoming a powerful voice for those who have served their country and are eager for another opportunity. It's not about being difficult, we're noticing trends in the services veterans need most, which is assisting hospitals in better allocating resources. Big Nathan gave a seminar on security standards. His explanation was clear. An official from the Pentagon approached Miss Walker, asking if she would be willing to consult on the expansion. The Iron Raiders patch had become a symbol of service, drawing veterans from all walks of life. Grace watched as the former rivals sat together, planning expansion strategies. Prior to Grace's response, the hospital's code blue and pediatrics alerts went off, triggering her nursing instincts. However, the subsequent events demonstrated just how drastically things had changed. Audience members started coordinating with security to manage the crowd, while Doc and other former medics hurried to offer assistance. "See that chain," one of them told the military official. "This application truly signifies that." Grace ended up in the hospital chapel with Titan when the situation subsided. "I never imagined I'd see the day when we're integrated into the hospital's emergency response system." He whispered, "My guys are directing traffic in a hospital, helping save lives." "You were always capable of this," to which Grace responded, "You just forgot for a while." She then corrected him. This movement, which began as a confrontation in a parking lot, is now taking place all over the country, as Claire enthusiastically explained. Claire jumped in to interrupt Grace, who needed to see this, because the videos from today's presentation had gone viral and Veterans Alliances were trending nationwide. Stories of other hospitals and motorcycle clubs connecting, inspired by the Walter Reed model, descended into social media. Just 2 months into the program, Grace had an unexpected visitor in her office. Lisa Chen, an elderly woman who had been harassed by the Death Reapers, stood in her doorway holding a large photo album. "Miss Walker, I wanted to show you something," she said, placing the album on Grace's desk. "You've started something amazing." "We all did," Grace corrected every person who chose to believe in the program and be part of the solution instead of the problem. As they walked back to the auditorium, Grace watched Lieutenant Rodriguez teach a young writer about his new prosthetic. The writer, a former death dealer, listened intently, his face displaying genuine concern and interest. Grace said to herself, "That's the real victory, not changing organizations, but changing hearts." With tears in her eyes, Lisa explained that her son is training to become a writer and that he wants to help other wounded warriors find strength again. Suddenly, there was a commotion in the hallway, and Doc burst into his face. Grace was already on the move, and there was a major pileup on the interstate. Several casualties, including veterans and their families, were there. There are at least 15 cars from nearby hospitals working together, but due to the jammed traffic, emergency personnel are unable to reach the scene. Titan have materialized in the entrance, and riders are en route to the site. Dr. Harrison observed from the emergency room as victims arrived, each accompanied by riders who had cleared their way to the hospital. This is more than we ever imagined. Over the next few hours, we created emergency lanes and helped first responders reach the victims. What happened next demonstrated how far the Veterans Alliance had come. A police officer later told Grace that she had never seen anything like it. Former combat medics were among the riders who worked seamlessly with emergency services, providing initial care until paramedics could arrive. Grace, he began. Big Nathan oversaw their integration into our emergency response system from the command center, so they're no longer merely an escort service. Families attempting to get to 3 separate hospitals were directed to the appropriate places by the signs they had put up. As Grace observed his former adversaries mending fences and putting aside their differences to aid those in need, Rick, who had been leading a group of riders in coordination with the police, said, "You know, what's really amazing," as she joined Grace at the window. After things had calmed down, Titan took Grace to the parking lot to show her something else, a mobile medical response unit that had been donated by one of our corporate sponsors. The riders, who wore patches from various clubs like the Iron Raiders, former Death Reapers, and other local MCs, all shared the Veterans Alliance patch, which had become a symbol that transcended old rivalries. "We have veterans on staff with medical experience," he said, "and Doc was already teaching riders on the equipment, so it's fully prepared for emergency reaction. Now it's about more than simply the hospital." He stated to Grace, "We're building something bigger, a network of veterans helping veterans ready to respond wherever we're needed." The local news had come to cover the interstate incident, but they uncovered a much larger story. They recorded riders from former rival clubs working together, as veteran patients helped coordinate response efforts, and families found safety and support during the crisis. A reporter named Miss Walker was even summoned. "What is it like to witness the impact of your program going beyond the confines of a hospital?" Grace responded, "This isn't my show anymore. It is for all the riders who volunteered to help, all the veterans who discovered a new meaning in their lives, and all the families who realized they weren't alone. Come join them, Lieutenant Rodriguez, who is now using a cane. One of the greatest parts is that it offers hope to other veterans because they see us making a difference. Helps them see that there is meaning in life after service and injuries." As the workday drew to a close, Grace and Lisa Chen returned to their office, where Grace's photo album remained open. "You did more than just defend the hospital when you confronted those bikers on that first day," Lisa whispered. "You exemplified true strength for all of us." Grace stood in the lobby of the hospital, which had just undergone renovations, 3 months after the program had begun. As I watched the installation of a massive mural, I couldn't help but be moved by the depiction of riders from various clubs coming together to support soldiers and their families. The patches on their clothing reflected a newfound unity in a community where conflict had previously existed. "What a dramatic shift from the day you dragged me into this lobby." Chain's announcement that I was to join her. Still hurting from Grace's question, but dang, it was the best decision we ever made. A youthful biker was assisting a wheelchair-bound veteran at the entry, he said. Wearing a Death Reaper's cut, the motorcyclist proudly showed the Veterans Alliance patch. That is the explanation of Tommy Titan. Exactly 1 year ago. He had joined the wrong crowd and was now furious with the world. As a mentor to young vets, he is among the best of his kind. The enthusiastic Dr. Emily Brooks Grace, this is unbelievable. Do you recall the research we initiated to determine the program's effect on patients' rates of recovery? The final product exceeded our expectations. The recovery rates of veterans participating in the program are considerably higher. Greater results in mental health and stronger networks of family support outside. The sound of motorbikes rumbled and cut off the discussion. Lieutenant Rodriguez, meanwhile, rode up in a group of bikers on a bike he had customized for his injuries. This time, though, things were different. As Grace drew near, he boastfully proclaimed his first solo ride, saying, "I couldn't have done it without this program. Without you, I would be completely broke." Additional motorcycles, each transporting a veteran who had successfully finished rehabilitation, pulled up behind him. The recovery riders were a group of people who had been through the same thing and were now helping others on the road to recovery. Here is the crux of the matter. Big Nathan spoke with a heavy heart as he assisted them in regaining their strength while also healing. Outside of the new medical response team, Doc had been instructing a different set of seasoned riders in the art of emergency response. His message came from Baltimore, where he said that 15 hospitals are now administering the program, thanks to the formation of their Veterans Alliance branch. Grace saw as once hostile horsemen accompanied families as they arrived for visits. The entire hospital culture had undergone a shift, and it wasn't limited to the motorcyclists. One day, while we were all terrified of them, a nurse questioned Claire. "Hearing the bikers pull up now makes me feel safer." A further surprise arrived that day. Arriving in a dapper business suit was a woman escorting a bunch of corporate executives. "My name is Jennifer Hayes, and I am with the National Veteran Support Foundation. My name is Miss Walker." Grace, who has been keeping a careful eye on your show, observed that Big Nathan and Titan were both looking more put together, despite their leather haircuts. Jennifer persisted in saying that what you have made here is stunning. "We are eager to lend a hand in conducting it around the country with support from corporations for any." Just as Grace was about to reply, the alarm went off once more. This time, though, everything functioned as intended. Everyone at the hospital appeared to be breathing in unison as riders cleared routes and support personnel mobilized. With a gesture toward the coordinated response, Grace informed Jennifer, "Because it's natural, this is effective." Why? Because these individuals rediscovered service as they helped staff and patients through the situation. Jennifer was astonished to see how former rival gang members worked together so flawlessly. Additionally, Grace mentioned that the reason it's already becoming nationwide is not due to corporate support, but rather the readiness of veterans worldwide to serve once again. All they had to do was see that it was doable. After Grace left the entertainment room, she saw Titan instructing a young soldier in the ways of motorcycle repair. His hands trembled from post-traumatic stress disorder, but they became steady as he concentrated on the engine. Titan informed her that it's about more than just riding anymore. Recalling Lisa Chen's remarks, Grace highlighted that it's about providing them with a purpose, an accomplishment, and a reason to live. Adding a new ritual to the day's finale as a tangible reminder that protection isn't merely about power, but also about dedication and caring, the nightly patrol riders from all clubs encircled the hospital grounds. Grace went to a special ceremony in the main courtyard of the hospital 4 months into the program. The Nationwide Veterans Alliance Network launched its official website today. Just 4 months ago, Grace muttered to Dr. Harrison, "If you told me that throwing a biker would lead to this. To be honest, I would have thought you were completely insane." Bikes shimmered in the dawn light as riders from every chapter crowded into the courtyard. But the new patch's unveiling, a design that blended medical and military symbols with the usual MC imagery, was what really grabbed everyone's attention. The patch Titan that were revealed to the assembled audience symbolizes more than only our partnership. Remembering the meaning of true strength and serving one's country are the promises it symbolizes. An unannounced guest abruptly entered the ceremony. Colonel James Maxwell, Grace's former commanding officer in Afghanistan, rode up in a procession of motorcycles she hadn't seen in years. "I had to witness it for myself after hearing that you were transforming bikers into heroes, so I reached out to you, Captain Walker," using her former rank. Being present during the ambush that won Grace her Silver Star gave the event more gravitas, and the colonel addressed the gathering, saying, "What you've built here is truly remarkable. What you've done with the camaraderie of fighting is groundbreaking and important. Local officials requested assistance evacuating vulnerable veterans from flood-prone regions when emergency calls began pouring in, seemingly to back up his claim that a huge storm was on its way. What followed was proof of how far they had gone. Teams of writers were quickly formed by the assembled authors. Doc managed the medical support, Big Mike was in charge of logistics, and Titan was in charge of the entire operation. Grace remarked to Colonel Maxwell, just like old times, as they observed the response. The only difference is that this time, they are saving lives before the crisis even occurs. The colonel gave a satisfied nod. Despite appearances, you have a natural talent for converting foes into friends. The successful completion of the evacuation operation proved the program's worth. Volunteers coordinated with regional rescue agencies. Their expertise in the veteran community is proven to be priceless. Sector 4 has a wounded veteran. The radio picked up Rick's voice. Elevators not working, power outage group's recuperation efforts in response to the motorcyclist's questions. Lieutenant Rodriguez. For just such instances, his squad had specialized training. From her vantage point in the command center, Grace saw as the once enemies worked together in perfect harmony, putting aside their differences to aid those in need. Claire made an incredible observation, you know. It's not just veterans that we're evacuating. Everyone in town is looking to us for assistance. It was her correct, a reliable group for responding to emergencies, the Veterans Alliance. From disaster assistance to medical transport, their riders were needed for everything. Grace joined forces with Colonel Maxwell and Shackles as the storm grew worse, organizing responses all throughout the city. Her mind went to military operations, but there was one major difference with this scene. Here, you're fighting for community and winning, as the colonel pointed out. During wartime, hundreds of individuals had been safely evacuated by the time night fell thanks to the effort. A team of seasoned riders responded to scores of medical emergencies at the hospital. She was approached by a Federation official from the agency that oversees your program, Miss Walker. Your achievements thus far. It's never happened before, but Grace couldn't help but focus on anything else. As a once enraged teenage death dealer named Tommy watches a veteran enter a shelter, he gently guides the veteran into the building. There was a shift outside of the company as well. All those concerned felt it deeply. This is obvious to you. As they observed the riders making their way back from their missions, Titan eventually inquired. We've evolved into more than just a hospital program. A greater thing is emerging from us. We were always, Grace said. All we needed was for other people to notice. As the tempest raged outside the hospital, a significant confirmation had been made within. Transportation and security weren't the only things the Veterans Alliance helped with anymore. It had transformed into a catalyst for constructive transformation, transforming enemies into heroes for the community.
Disclaimer. This channel stands against all forms of intolerance, discrimination, racism, and violations of human rights. The stories shared here are original creations, developed to encourage reflection, understanding, and constructive dialogue. All content is produced with a commitment to respecting diversity and honoring human dignity.